Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. I hope all of you are doing well. This lecture, we are going to be covering an entire decade, but I know you're probably thinking, like, how exactly is it going to, cover the entire 1970s? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to emphasize a certain areas from the 1970s, which I think have a lot to do with not only how that decade has been come to be viewed historically, but also how it has affected our current state of affairs, whether that's politically, socially, culturally, economically. And so I'll be giving you guys some comparisons. But the center of this talk is going to be looking at the 70s in terms of the political shifts that happened during this period. Uh, Deindustrialization, which is a heavy part of that aspect, as well as what has come to be known as American disillusionment. And we'll be looking at that from the aspect of really the areas of culture. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of the objectives that we want to look at. So, of course, as I mentioned, deindustrialization, but definitely going to be looking at the economic changes that really shift from the 1960s to the 1970s. We're going to be looking at a lot of the cultural changes, a lot of the political changes, and how people responded to those. And of course, when I talk about American disillusionment, what I want you to think about is how Americans during the 1970s were really feeling about themselves. Like, what does it mean to be an American? Does this mean that the American dream is something that's still possible? How does the standing of the United States in the world matter to the individual? How do they see themselves as a part of a community, part of a country, part of a nation, right? And how exactly are those things shifting? So we'll be taking a look at all of those just to give you guys, a little disclaimer is that of course there's going to be things that I'm going to miss. And if there's anybody in this class who actually lived during this period, I would love to be able to get some of your perspectives. I was not alive during the 70s. I'm actually a child of the 80s. My parents were alive during the 70s, so of course they've told me stories and me being a lover of history, it's certainly an area that I have read and investigated and researched about. But for those of you who may have lived during this period or any memories that may have been passed down from people who did, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, love for you to share those, because I think it's fascinating to hear from those individuals who may remember a certain event or a certain time period and how they've come to understand it, not just when they were going through it, but how they understand it now. Okay, so if there is a term that we could use to describe um, the economy, the experience of the 1970s in terms of economics, the word is stagflation. Now, you may have heard this word thrown around if you watch some of the money market videos or if you've seen something on TikTok, any of the news shows that have talked about how the economy is doing. And, stagflation is really quite serious. It was a very impactful aspect to the economy. And essentially, what it is it means that there is a high rate of inflation, meaning that the cost of the everyday things that you need to live, your gasoline, the cost of energy, food, rent, clothing, everything was going up. Growth was pretty much stagnant. It wasn't moving. And there was elevated unemployment. Okay. So if we think about today, are we experiencing high inflation? We are. Is it as high as it was in the 1970s? No, but it's high, right? People are paying $4 an average for gas if you drive. You have noticed that over the past 2 years, 3 years, your grocery prices have gone up. The cost of energy, electricity, the gas to heat your home has all gone up. And because of the recent events that have happened in Iran, even with a tenuous ceasefire, the effects of farmers not getting the fertilizer that they need, us not getting the gasoline that we need, us not being able to get the resources that we need, all of this affects the market. Now, we are not in a place of high unemployment, right? At least not in certain sectors. But there are certain sectors that are not doing very well. So, this is something to be considered. You hear the term stagflation, but we're really looking at this period being something like right now we are experiencing high inflation, moderate growth, unemployment is, you know, it's at a decent place, but it's certainly still too high for the Federal Reserve. But they obviously are trying to make their adjustments because they see how much inflation is going on, and so they're trying to balance it out. But if we look at what caused this period in the 1970s, remember coming out of the 1960s, the economy was actually doing rather well, right? There was massive industrial output and growth. There are jobs, people are going to school, people are having families, there's that baby boom. So there's a lot of positivity that's going on in the country, and that is seen in the behaviors as not just in the spending, but in terms of families, communities, etc. In the 1970s, that begins to change, and that is due to several reasons. One is the way that production was changing around the world. In the 1950s and the 1960s, one of the reasons that the United States had such an incredible industrial and production boom is mainly due to the fact that other countries didn't have the infrastructure, the technology, or the know-how to compete with us. Remember, World War II devastated the economies of Western and Eastern Europe, as well as Japan. So what happens during the 50s and 60s is that these economies are still trying to get back up on their feet. They're still trying to be able to rebuild themselves. They are trying to come out of that post-war period. That wasn't an effect for us. We were not the only territory that we had at the time that was attacked was Pearl Harbor, and that was our military. So we didn't lose any major infrastructure in terms of our agriculture or our major city centers, right? We weren't having to worry about rebuilding our factories like they did in Europe as well as in Asia. And so what you see here is that after that period in the 50s and 60s, we're dominating. By the 70s, Germany and Japan are now strong competitors. They are able to produce high quality goods. They're able to produce products that Americans and the world is actually interested in buying, whether it is cars, electronics, clothing, other technological items such as radios or watches, right? All of these things are being produced, and they can produce it cheaper than the United States, or at least at the same rate as the United States. So what ends up happening is that because the United States did not have these protectionary tariffs, the market in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s was completely open. So what they found is they found a huge reception in terms of the products that started to come in. And so what ended up happening is that while American spending continued to increase, American productivity began to decrease. Why? Because if people are buying more items that are foreign, there's less demand for the goods that are local, right? And so what ends up happening is that we produce less, and as a result of that, there's less jobs, less productivity, less spending, and all of this affects the economy. And so this was one of the first aspects. So we have new competition. The second is something that experienced in two different periods during the 1970s, and that is the energy crisis. There is a oil embargo that happens between 1973 and 1974, and then there is another oil crisis that happens in 1979. So what ends up happening is that basically in 1973, the United States decided to side with Israel in terms of its war that it was waging in the area for expanding its territories and expanding its borders. Does that sound familiar like it is today? You bet. So as a result, the the oil producing nations during the time known as OPEC, these individuals decided to slow production and raise prices just as a way to hurt. This was a retaliatory effort on the American economy, and boy, did it hurt. The price per barrel of of oil goes from basically $3 to $12. I mean, four times the price. So if you were filling up your tank for $10, it's now $40. Okay. And so this is something that seriously hits the United States because as the price of energy goes up and spending goes up in that area, less spending is being put into other places. And remember, the United States runs, as it did in the 1970s, as it does today, is it runs on energy. And our energy comes from oil and it comes from natural gas. In the 1970s, when the oil prices go up, everything else skyrockets. Why? Because your food comes in on a truck, your house is being heated with oil, your the energy that we use to supply anything that we produce, whether it's in a factory, in a business, it requires energy. And so everything is going to go up in terms of cost. So this was the second thing. The third thing was the government policies at the time. So the Federal Reserve Chairman, his name was Burns at the time, and this is one of the biggest problems with stagflation, is that you have three areas that are problematic: inflation, growth, and unemployment. Now, the biggest problem with stagflation is that if you are the Federal Reserve, which is meant to keep employment steady and high, inflation low, and economic growth consistent, what ends up happening is that if you touch one, the other two get affected negatively. It's very difficult to attack all three. And so what ends up happening is that there is essentially what the Fed tries to do is they are attempting to say like, okay, you know what we'll do is we will try to address this issue of high inflation, so we will lower the interest rates. Well, if they lower the interest rates, then the economic growth can become more stagnant and employment can go up. Or if they decide to try to raise the interest rates so that they can slow down, the economic growth so that it doesn't go overboard, then they invariably hurt inflation, right? So this is what the problem is. And so at the time, the Fed chair as well as the Federal Reserve didn't really actually understand what was going on with stagflation because it is one of the worst aspects to it. Because what always ends up happening in these series of events in stagflation is a long-term economic recession. And that is precisely what actually happened in the late 1970s, beginning around 1977. Okay, so those are the three things that causes stagflation. So we already know that when the economy isn't doing well, you already don't feel well, right? You don't really feel like things are going well for you. Why? Because everything costs so much. You don't feel like you're saving enough money. You're not able to do the things that you want to do. So just put that into context of what was going on at the time. Now, one of the other contributing factors of this economy was that things were actually changing because of the competition that was going on across the globe, and in terms of the global markets being more integrated with each other, the United States begins to take a couple of changes in terms of its own economy. And the main one is moving from a producing nation, one that is more in lines with factory production, to service. So the economy changes industrial, factory to service. And so this is where this really begins. The first step in this is what happens when the United States decides to move away from the gold standard. Okay. So I know that this is probably, you're probably like, why gold standard? Like, yes. So at one time, all currency was tied to the amount and the rate and the value of gold that a country had on hand. One of the name of this system at the time was called the Bretton Woods system. And this system essentially was an agreement between various countries that they would all run their economies on the gold standard. Well, in 1971, under President Richard Nixon, he decided to leave the gold standard and instead tie the economy to a rate of, credit that would allow the United States more of a flexibility to be able to expand its economy in terms of a capitalist system that would actually put more money or credit into the actual system of buying and spending, right? Now, the problem with this is that when you end the dollar's, convertibility to gold, okay, imbalances of trade start to happen immediately, right? So what ends up happening is that imports start to get boosted in because more people have money and they're able to buy. And if we do not have the ability in which to produce or meet that demands, it's going to be met with something else. Plus, more people have money because of the expansionary monetary policy that removes us from the gold standard. So people have more access to the goods. The problem is that if more goods are coming in and we're not producing as much or meeting the demands here, our services and our productivity ultimately goes down. Okay. So instead of us producing everything that everybody wants, our production starts to decrease. And instead of us actually producing the goods, we're actually more in terms of the design or creating the services, right? For these industries. And so what we saw during this period of economic stagflation was huge amount of plant closures, especially in the area known as the Rust Belt. And I'm going to show you that area, right? And so when you think about these areas of, the amount of factories that we used to have, basically from the 1940s all the way up until the 1970s, is that we basically went from, if you want to look at like steel, for instance, right? We're talking like well over 130 million tons of steel that's produced in 1970. And then literally 12 years later, it's down to about 90 million tons. Okay? Think about that, right? We're talking about the difference of 50 million tons. Production has gone down by well over 35 to 40%. That's a huge hit. That's jobs, those are economies, those are impacts that are happening to people in terms of employment. And so when these people lost their jobs in these areas of factory services, these people didn't just find new jobs somewhere else, right? They weren't just like, oh, well, I'm going to leave the steel mill so that I can go become an engineer. That's not how this worked at all. They had to either find something similar or they had to find another factory job. But if factories are closing and production is moving outside in terms of the global market because other countries are able to do it more effectively for less money and produce a similar product, these people started to lose their entire livelihoods. And so what ends up happening here is that the shift in our economy from production to service begins to take place. And you see this in several areas. Healthcare begins to grow, right? So not just in terms of like healthcare of like nurses and doctors, but we're also talking about like hospital administrators, health insurance, right? Looking at technology and finance, people that are making money in terms of the stock market, people that are working in terms of HR, people that are working more in terms of like computers and design. And then, of course, we see this geographic shift that happens as well as a consequence from the factories that are closing in this area of the Rust Belt to what is known as the Sun Belt. So let me show you about the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is located here, basically from Schenectady, New York, all the way to basically Davenport, Illinois, southern part of, Illinois as well. And this is also, it goes in the areas of the coal-rich areas of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Tennessee. Okay. So when we think of the Rust Belt, we're talking about, major areas where they produce automobiles, where they produce steel, where they produce iron, right? These are the areas that had been the epicenter of productivity during the 1870s through the 1960s. But this all begins to change, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Okay, so one of the first reasons was the outsourcing that was already taking place. Right. We already see that there's other competition coming from Asia and Europe in terms of the factory production. And so we're already seeing that competition affect the bottom line. We also are seeing that there are other regions in the United States that are far more friendly to business, right? And I'm going to show you like how exactly and why exactly they'd be friendlier. Like we're talking lower taxes or no taxes whatsoever. They also have less regulations. And there is also the ability to make better profits in terms of, moving their goods and their services quickly across borders or onto trains or boats to be shipped out to market. Finally, it was the continuous labor conflicts that were consistent during the 1970s. The working class in the 1970s and the 1980s, to put it bluntly, got its ass kicked. And the reason for this is largely because labor costs were continually going up and up and up. What once used to be jobs that would be able to take care of you from cradle to grave, essentially, that would guarantee, raises, pensions, the ability in which to retire, all of those things, the costliness of this just skyrocketed during the 70s, mainly because of the issues that we were having in terms of outside competition as well as the energy crises. And so when you think about this in terms of the conflicts, strikes, the ability for workers to, unionize, these were some of the contributing factors that moved factories either to close or to move south. And that's why the decline of the Rust Belt. We still see the effects of this today. Now, there are some examples of where you have seen areas make a comeback. So, like, for instance, Buffalo, New York was able to turn itself into more of like a tech hub. You've seen the areas of like Milwaukee improve itself, but there are other areas that are still having major problems, right? You see areas such as like the decline where Pittsburgh is, Columbus, Ohio, Akron, Ohio, right? These are areas that have still suffered and have not been able to rebound and have continually seen a decline, not just in terms of their population, but in terms of their, the resources, the tax base. It is important to understand that when these factories close, some of these factories are the lifeline for the entire community. If this is a factory that employs, let's say, 50% of the community, that means that most of the other businesses that are in that community depend on that factory for employing its people so that they can spend at their businesses, grocery stores, people that have send their children to schools, the local hospitals, other resources, and other businesses that thrive off of making their money off of the people who work at the companies. Once the companies and the factories close, the entire business structure of the cities begin to close, and this is what affects the tax base. So if there's no factory, there's no people making money, no people spending money, so there's no money to be made. If there's no money to be made, there's no taxes. No taxes mean no infrastructure. No infrastructure means the town essentially goes dead. And that's what has been happening throughout the areas of the Rust Belt for the last 50 years. And so when we think about this as a result of in the 1970s, the decline in the Rust Belt, we saw a growth in the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is these areas here, basically everywhere from Raleigh to Sacramento, California. Now, we still see the continual growth in these areas, particularly in the last 10 years. We've seen increases in areas such as Austin, Houston, Atlanta, Tampa, Charleston, Charlotte, right? Increase in Nashville, right? But there are places that have seen a decline as well. California, San Francisco, Oakland, where I'm from, right? I left Oakland in 2015. I sold all of my assets and everything else in 2019, moved all of my stuff to Atlanta, right? Why? Taxes are cheaper. You could have a better lifestyle. The resources are better, right? So you can see the same reasons that people leave California are very much the same reasons that people were leaving the Rust Belt. So the Sun Belt in the 1970s really attracted businesses for several reasons. Lower labor and operating costs. The taxes are lower in the South. There's the land is cheaper, right? The resources, the infrastructure is cheaper, right? We have the access to be able to buy things out there. It's very simple. When I sold my house in California, I was able to buy a home in Atlanta outright simply with the money that, I had earned from my house sale in California. I could never do that in California. California, I mean, now if you look at the prices of homes all over the country, average, home is going to be like, especially if you're looking at like a 3 bedroom, 2 bath, like the average is going to be somewhere around $300,000. There's not a lot of people that can afford that. And especially if you're in a city, like a major city, like in Atlanta, a Miami, outside of Chicago, right? Outside of Houston, right? These are areas that are extremely expensive. And so the cost of living has definitely gone up as more people have had the influx. But in the 1970s, these were the cities to move to because it was cheaper. It's also cheaper for companies to move there because of the right to work laws, right? In many of the northeastern states in the Rust Belt and the Midwest, as well as out west, there are areas where there are many regulations that prevent people from getting fired, right? You have to show with cause, or you have to be able to, demonstrate why this person is going to get fired. In the South, it's not a right to work state. They can just fire you for any reason that they want at any time. And so this is what allows, factory owners, excuse me, to keep their factory workers in check. That it's like, oh, okay, no strikes. There's no unions here. No problem. You don't want to work, you're fired. I'll find somebody else. Right. So they can keep up productivity. They can be able to, increase their ability to maximize profits. And unions were lower about by, almost by 2 times lower than they are up in the northern area. Also, these business friendly policies, lower tax rates, reduced regulations of burdens, right? I mean, there's a whole slew of government regulations that governed, factories. But down in the South, it's a little bit more lax, right? So it's more favorable to business. They want to be able to make money. They want to be able to produce. And of course, also the abilities to move your goods and services around. There's great infrastructure down in the South. They have ports, they have airports, they have railroads, especially in the 1970s. So this was what the attraction was. So you also want to just think about how, the 1970s and over, from the 1970s to currently to the pandemic, how the population has changed. And you can see it right there. Florida, Texas, the areas in the South, Alabama, Georgia, I mean, North Carolina, look at these areas, Arizona, New Mexico, increased dramatically over the last 50 years. And this is largely due because of the changes in the type of economy that was happening in the 1970s. We are still seeing this change in this shift today. People still move for various reasons for the econ and usually it's because of the economy, right? If there are jobs, if there's better resources, if the tax base is better, if there's opportunities there, people are going to move if they can. Right. And so what you want to do is you want to think about like, well, why exactly have certain areas not really grown or improved at a certain rate? So, it stands to reason, why certain areas have been areas that have lost. You look at Ohio, look at Pennsylvania there, look at West Virginia, look at Illinois, look at Michigan, all the areas of the Rust Belt, right? All the areas that used to be major factory producing areas, all the areas that there was major infrastructure. And now we see people where they are moving to is largely from the South, right? Even myself, who still, has a home in Atlanta, I'm living up here in the North. But chances are, at some point, if I have the ability, I'd like to be able to go to a place where the taxes are lower, where the resources are lower, and not to mention the weather. The weather up here, much like in parts of, the Rust Belt, it's cold. And I mean, if you like the cold, more power to you. But myself, I'm like, I think I'd rather have it just be a little bit warmer. Okay. The 70s were also a period of leadership problems. You had several scandals. You had two one-term presidents that served during this period. There were three presidents during the 70s: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. Two Republicans and a Democrat. The reason why there was such a crisis of leadership, it really began after we left Vietnam in 1973 and officially pulled out in 1979 with the fall of Saigon. The main issue that really plagued this period was the fact that there was the loss of faith in the government. Remember, really begins in the 1960s when people begin to realize that what they're telling us about, oh, the ability to defeat the enemy, and this is why we're in Vietnam, and all these aspects, people already had an eroding support for belief in their elected leaders. But it actually gets even worse. The Watergate scandal, who many of you have probably heard of, right? This was a huge scandal because what ends up happening is that President Richard Nixon decides to break in to the Democratic offices at the new Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and basically sends his spies in to try to figure out how they could manipulate and use the information that the Democrats were trying to use in terms of tactical maneuvering for their candidates so that he could be able to benefit from that in the election. I mean, this is extremely scandalous. Like this is just absolutely unheard of. And the fact is that, he lied about it. Nixon decided that, oh, I didn't do it. It was he tried to make a cover up. And this just basically lets people know to build off of the faith that they had already lost because of Vietnam in their elected leaders to just re-solidify it. You can't trust anybody. Can't trust anybody. You can't trust our elected leaders. They're not trying to do right for you. They're just trying to do what's good for themselves, right? It gets even worse. It gets even worse because when Richard Nixon resigns and Gerald Ford, his vice president, becomes president in 1974, what ends up happening is that Gerald Ford immediately loses the public's possibility of deciding that, hey, you know what, it's possible we could possibly maybe move on from this and heal our wounds. What does he do? He pardons Richard Nixon. And so it just solidified it again for people. People are like, oh, okay, so the bad guys win, the crooks win, people in power just take care of themselves, right? Total loss in confidence in terms of what's going on. Additionally, Congress was the only group that seemed to actually be trying to do anything for the American people. They established the Freedom of Information Act. Many of you guys have heard this, a FOIA, right? The ability to be able to access information because they were sick and tired of these ideas that there are tapes out there and that people are keeping information and keeping secrets, and the wars that Richard Nixon, whether it was bombing Laos and Cambodia, saying, oh, I'm not bombing anybody, but he's actually terrorizing and completely destroying these countries, right? So these individuals just create this total loss of faith, total loss of faith in elected leaders. And then it only gets worse. You have Gerald Ford, who is basically seen as this bumbling fool. He fell down more times than any president in history, whether it was, just totally clumsy, falling down, the stairs at Air Force One, and, tripping over things. But his presidency also demonstrates how people were so frustrated. He had two assassination attempts on him, and people were just completely outraged with what was going on. He seemed to be completely impotent to be able to answer the issues of the economy. He didn't have an answer in terms of how people were going to solve these issues of inflation, with plant closures, with society just falling apart, right? This period of the 70s just absolutely sucks. Like there is just a period where it's just absolutely terrible. And then lo and behold, here we go, the election of 1977, and they decide to elect Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is a governor, a peanut farmer from New York, right? Total outsider to the system, right? Doesn't know Washington politics, doesn't know how to get anything done, and is seen as essentially just completely inefficient and ineffectual. He actually has a speech, and it's called The Crisis of Confidence, right? And you can take a look at it. I put it up on the link. You can also click on it here, okay? But it also has another name. And the name is known as the Malaise speech. He gives this in 1979. And he essentially says that the problem with America is that we have lost our ability, our sense of who we are, and our confidence as a country. That our problem is not just long gas lines or inflation or the environment. It's a fact that there's something deeper about us as Americans. And guess who the problem is? It's you, as he's saying this to the American people. Now, he doesn't say that directly, but that's essentially what people took away from this speech. They're like, wait a second. He's not going to take any responsibility for it. He's not going to try to solve any of this. It's our problem. The American people, you want to know what your biggest enemy is? It's you. You're the biggest problem. That's not exactly what people want to hear when they've already lost confidence in their leaders. So in 1979, Carter just sealed it for people. People's, feeling of their about elected leaders was at an all-time low. People were over it, essentially. So to know that, to understand that, when you want to know where people, where we used to be as a country, where people would be like, you know what, I may disagree with the president, but I'm still going to respect him. The president is going to do as much as he can, and you know what, I'm going to be behind him, especially when it's those times we have to come together. If you want to know where the period where we started to give up and that first moment where we actually questioned if our elected leaders really had our best interests, this is it. The 1970s is it. Nixon, you know, For, Ford and Carter. This is the group. Okay. Now, as a result of the leadership that we had, the fall of Saigon, the Iranian Revolution that happens under Carter's watch, the 1979 hostage crisis that takes place, where literally 444 days, dozens of our American hostages are held by Iranian students and revolutionaries. All of these things begin to, challenge this idea of the dominance, the supremacy, the talent, the ability of America, right? Because here we are spending all of this time and money and resources in Vietnam, and the country turns communist, right? None of that worked. As you can see, this top image here is one of the most famous images in the fall of Saigon. People are literally trying to get on every helicopter that they can to get out of the city. Look like anything familiar, like the exit out of Afghanistan in 2022, right? This is exactly the same thing. Spent all this time trying to rebuild a country, trying to bring a democracy, trying to bring opportunity, and look at it fails. And this is our hasty exit. And this is what ends up happening. We went from Taliban to United States, management and United States present and occupation back to Taliban. We went from Vietnam, who was, occupied by, communist rebels to American presence back to communist dictatorship and rule, right? This is what, completely reinforces this idea that America has seen its better days, that it is no longer this, powerful, force in the world. It is simply a paper tiger. They can't do anything. Right. And it was really the bumbling and the fumbling of leaders such as Ford and Carter that just made it worse. We just looked like we were a completely deflated nation. You're telling me that we have an Iranian revolution that's going on here and we can't stop this? We can't send in our military and just take our hostages out? That's how weak we are? Wow. Okay. And it went on for 441 days, over a year. Think about that. Every single day is a reminder. Day 32, day 65, day 109 of the Iranian crisis, right? Walter Cronkite, Jessica Savage, all of the anchors of the 1970s, this is what they're telling you, right? And so this is one of the things is when we had this, this example of us being that beacon of democracy, that international player, the people, the biggest one in the room that can dictate and decide and be able to dominate. No longer. The 70s is when that begins to be that sort of, mystique, that veneer, if you will, begins to start to chip, right? It's not exactly as solid as we thought it was, right? It's a patina. And so this is where it starts to be questioned. Finally, what ends up happening as a result of these economic periods, right? This loss in the stagflation, right? All of these areas, what we see is we start to see a rise in what is known as the new right. Okay. Now, there's a couple of areas to be able to think about how this actually happens. And it's really a pushback based off of what happened during the 1960s in terms of Great Society, the Civil Rights Movement, the expansion and changes in terms of identity politics and how people were going to be able to, take on these new opportunities for participation in voting, in the workplace, in education, right? The economy certainly plays a role in the shift that people had from moving from Democrats to Republicans, right? Mainly what it has to do with is that what you see individuals such as like Jerry Falwell, who develops this group known as the moral majority, where he takes these ideas of traditional values, right? Critiquing the fact that what happened during the 1960s was an assault on the American family, that the American system of values was being under assault, namely because of these new opportunities and new rights and new expansive thoughts in terms of who can participate in this democracy. Women asserting their ability not just to exercise their rights in terms of a vote, but in terms of the home, in terms of the pill, abortion, right? Gay rights, rights for Black people, right? Opportunities in terms of education, affirmative action, right? All of these things begin to be associated, right, with for the moral majority as an assault on those values which they tie to traditional American values. The new expanding America that was a part of this vision in the 1960s, where all people can participate, right? For this group, the moral majority, they saw this as a threat. Now, you can take that as a threat in terms of like, well, it's threatening my position, my power, my influence. Maybe, right? But the cleverness of Jerry Falwell is that what he did was is he aligned traditional values with republicanism, right? That Republicans are the individuals of conservation and the family and traditions and morals, right? And the Democrats are the party of expanding rights and allowing people every opportunity and freedoms that are uncurbed and chaos and riots and et cetera, right? The same terms that you've heard President Trump talk about, those blue sanctuary cities and the dangers and the crises, is the same thing that was labeled on cities in the 1960s and 1970s by Republicans on the right, right? Cities of Oakland, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, right? Anywhere where there were riots in 1968 and 69 and 70, right? These were the same aspects. And so when you think about how the new right comes about, there's an interesting book. Um, where is it? It's this one. And let me find the other one. Here it is, All in the Family, right? Sorry, y'all. So there's two interesting books about this period. One is called Staying Alive, okay? And this is essentially this book is looking at the working class and how it ends. So this is all about the move from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt and essentially how working class America gets their asses handed to them in this, right? There's a fascinating aspect in terms of like the 1970s when we think about all of how the crises in energy, the change in the economy, how once people used to identify and associate stability, how all of those things are changing. And you see that in this book in terms of the working class. There's a movie about this that actually reflects American disillusionment among other films, but one that comes to mind is what is known as Dog Day Afternoon. It has Al Pacino. It's actually based on a true story of what actually happened. There was a bank robbery and everything else like this. But there's a great line in there where he's on the phone. He's in the bank. He has these hostages and everything else. And the air conditioner's off and it's in the middle of the summer and in New York and he's sweating and he says, "I'm dying here." What he's representing and what he's talking about is what many people and what Jerry Falwell and other conservatives at the time honed in on. is they honed in on a disillusionment that was associated with working class people. Working class people for the longest were always associated with Democrats. Why? Because Democrats were the ones that brought the New Deal under FDR. Democrats were the ones that were for unions and opportunities in terms of it, full employment, cradle to grave, all of this stuff. What the Republicans were never about any of that. They weren't about protecting workers or unions or anything else like that. They didn't give a damn about that. So what they did was is they capitalized on disillusionment as a way to be able to move these people like, well, the reason why you're feeling this way doesn't have anything to do with the fact that your factory closed or that, your kids are, that the school, the neighborhood that you live in is crap and everything else. All of that is a consequence of the fact that Black people have more rights, women are more independent, gays are able to be more open, right? And the way that you're feeling dying is because your identity is under attack. Your sense of self is under attack. That's what the right did. And they still do it today, right? You've seen how, the former Charlie Kirk, how Republicans continually talk about this idea that white culture is under assault, that white men are an endangered species, right? Like this is what they're preying off of is they're preying off this emotional state to motivate them to vote for those things that are against their interests. How well do you think any of those people who voted for Trump, the fact that some of them still believe that he is doing the right thing totally means that these people are in a point of disillusionment, right? Just like they were in the 1970s. Gas is, you know, $4 $4 a barrel, right? That means that it is essentially going to go from 16 cents to now it's 79 cents a gallon, right? I can't afford that. And so there's another book as well. It's called All in the Family. Okay. And that's actually a play on the television show All in the Family, Archie Bunker and those and his family, right? But essentially what this is that we need what they try to do is they try to understand he tries to understand the same thing, Robert O'Self, is that he tries to understand how we can move from a system under Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, in the 1960s that is meant to assist the working class to how all of those programs get co-opted and reversed in terms of a conscientious aspect by people like the alt-right, by Ronald Reagan in terms of this idea of family values, right? And so these are two books that you might want to pick up, definitely worth reading, fascinating stuff, but that's exactly how this new right begins to take place, right? Ones that is going to be focused on issues of morality and identity, preying on people's weakness. Because remember, when people are disillusioned about where they're going and what they are, they often attach themselves to leaders and to ideas that they don't really understand. And that is the reason why the 70s during this period are just as crucial as they are today. Because what we see is that in this period, this New Deal liberalism, right? The whole aspect that was associated with Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 60s takes a total shift, right? Why exactly should your taxes be going to schools that are busing your children to a school that they don't belong to or that they shouldn't be going to? Why should your taxes be paying for, the opportunities for other people? They should just work harder. You work hard. Shouldn't you be able to keep your money? This is building off for that alt-right, right? The new right, the tax revolt. This idea that your taxes, your money should be your own and no, it shouldn't be contributed. And one of the biggest examples during the 1970s is a man by the name of Howard Jarvis. And he was representative in a state representative in California in the 1970s. In 1978, the state of California passed a law through the voters. It's called Proposition 13. Essentially, what it did was is it said that the money, the tax base that you have based on your property taxes, it's no longer going to go to one central place, the central capital in Sacramento, and then to be distributed throughout the state equally so that all communities have a solid library. All the schools have science, wings and gyms and a cafeteria and cafeteria workers and all this other stuff. No, 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 no. It's just going to stay in your neighborhood, right? California at the time before 1978, everybody, it was very difficult to understand like where the like extremely like you knew where the neighborhoods of like the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor were. That was evident because you can understand like where exactly these areas were. But no matter where you were in terms of your socioeconomic status, everybody had access to a great library. All of the schools had fully staffed. All of the institutions had great gyms. All of these areas had support because the money was distributed equally so that the services that made the state successful, that kept crime down, that was able to keep people, give everybody opportunity for education, right? That put it into the California state system, the school system, right? All of this would be equal. Well, Jarvis and his individual cronies were like, no, we're not going to do that. We are going to make sure that the money shifts because people already at the time in the late 1970s already mistrust the government. It's already been starting. Look at who they've got in office. Carter, totally weak. This isn't going to work at all. And so what ends up happening is that he's able to feed off of people's angst, their anger, to be like, don't you think that you should keep all your money in your community? Don't you think that you should have all that money go to your school and for your kids? And so what this does is create further isolation, right? It begins to move away from that idea of a we, that we all take care of ourselves, each other in the community, that we build things for the public good, that there is an investment that we all can benefit from, whether it's our roads or our libraries or our hospitals, to no, this is just for me. I don't want to share this. I earn this money. It should be mine. And so essentially what you saw is an entire gutting of this system. This is one of the reasons why California today is one of the most highly unequal states in the country, precisely because of Proposition 13. Now, thankfully, Proposition 13, because it's in 1978, it only applies to the people who own property in 1978 or if they've bequeathed it to the next person. Here's the thing. It can only be bequeathed one time. So the tax base, in terms of those property taxes, while they're still going to stay in that area, some people are no longer going to be able to benefit from the limitations of how much your properties could be taxed. So proposition eventually is going to go out, but remember, it's been 50 years, so there's still, people that are still benefiting from it. So when we think about that, you also want to think about that the 70s were also a period of major social transformations. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into huge detail about this, but please feel free to investigate more. Women's liberation. So we're still going to be in the second wave of feminism. Title IX in 1972, Roe versus Wade, 1973, Equal Rights Amendment. Okay. LGBTQ, the Stonewall riots. Take a look at this. Great documentary on there in terms of how the LGBTQ movement was established and how it began to, how people were no longer willing to just accept being arrested and criminalized for being, same gender loving. This was also a period of huge environmentalism, not just because of the crises that were happening, whether it was Love Canal or 3 Mile Island. We had basically a nuclear meltdown in 3 Mile Island in the 1970s. And, the Love Canal controversy was a discovery of, people getting cancer just because of they were living on toxic waste that they didn't realize. This is what leads to the development of the EPA, the first Earth Day, Clean Air Act, all of those things. There was also a shift in social values, which is what I'm going to get into the American disillusionment. Essentially, what you could see is that this was becoming the me decade, right? We are moving from a period of unity, group, let's all move together, let's fight together, to one of personal liberation, right? We don't trust the institutions. I need to trust in myself. I can't believe that they actually know what they're talking about. I need to do it myself, right? And of course, because of the economy and its continual expansion from the post World War II period up until the 1970s was about prosperity, the benefits from the GI Bill, lower taxes, opportunities to expand your family, right? Cradle to grave in terms of the companies that you worked for. That is all disappearing. prosperity was contracting. Energy crisis, global standing decline, mistrust in leaders, changes in economic productivity, a general sense of malaise, ineffectual leadership. This is the 1970s. Okay. Now, there's also the continued struggle that actually takes place during this period. One that really sets apart most during the 1970s, not just women's liberation, not just LGBTQ, but one of the things that was probably the most impactful was affirmative action, as well as the issues of busing. Now, I put up a video on there that you should take a look at. It's called the busing controversy, and this actually looks at the busing controversy in Boston in the 1970s. Remember, with the passage of the Brown versus Board decision in 1954, in the 1970s, they're still trying to figure out how to desegregate schools. Okay. Integration, literally 20 years later, is still not happening. And so what ends up happening is that the very difficult aspect that is taking place states across the country is that courts are ordering schools to be integrated through this process of busing, where they would take one group of students from one side of the city to another side of the city to integrate, and they would switch. Here's the problem. Is that across the board, busing really did very little in terms of actually improving issues in terms of integration. There is some sort of moderate indication that there was some improvement for the students, but essentially what we can see from the data, as well as just from the qualitative data from people who lived during the period, what most people wanted was precisely to have equal resources and funding for their schools, no matter where they live. It wasn't just the fact that integration was an issue. It certainly was. But in Boston in particular, as you could see in the video, is that money was concentrated in certain neighborhoods and out of others. Namely, black and brown neighborhoods had poorer schools, the whiter schools had better. And this was because of the school superintendent system in terms of how money was allocated. This was the essential issue, is that neither black nor white wanted their kids bused. They wanted to go to a school in their own neighborhood. That was precisely the critique in Brown versus Board, is that, the young girls or the young girl didn't want to have to cross all the way over several miles in Topeka, Kansas to be able to get to the school. She wanted to go to the school in her neighborhood. And that is what essentially continued to create that controversy in terms of trying to solve for Brown versus Board. But essentially, what I want you to think about in terms of disillusionment is really like about where we are today. There is a wonderful essay, and I did put it up. It's by Tom Wolfe, and it was written in 1976. And it was called The Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening. Essentially, what he comes from this is that he sees that while the 1960s were about political movements, moving together, right? Trying to be able to figure out how we can solve these problems and make society better. The 70s move away from that and move into this idea of personal growth, self-gratification, self-aggrandizement, right? And this is really expressive, and you can see this in several different ways, especially in the culture of the period. And I'll get into that. The second part is that there was also new movements in terms of consciousness raising, right? How do we understand ourselves? How do we understand who we are and our purpose and our intention? No longer are we simply just tied to group identity. What about my individual identity? Who am I as a person as a consequence of being a part of this group, being a woman, being somebody who's black, being somebody who's gay, right? There's a shift from this idea, this third awakening from communalism to individualism, right? Is that no longer are we interested in using money to be able to help the group. I want to use that money to help myself, right? No more New Deal politics, no more big government, no more of this. We want to be able to solve things individually. And then finally, a move for consciousness, self-consciousness, as the religion, right? I don't have to believe in God. I believe in myself. I am my own person in terms of my own power. That becoming connected with the self was that form of therapy. It was that sense of 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 tradition and impact. And I want to, just to for you all to understand, if I can I press escape here? If I can get on to Chrome. There we go. Thank you. Okay. If we could take a look at some of the movies during this period, I mentioned Dog Day Afternoon, but there's also some other movies during this period that really capture this idea of disillusionment. Many of the movies that were made during the 70s are really trying to rationalize what the hell is going on in America. Who are we? Where are we going? What is happening? And whether you're looking at like one of the best examples to show how people just felt like things were falling apart were the disaster movies, which were very common during the 1970s. The Poseidon Adventure, where a boat literally turns upside down and people have to survive to try to get out. The Towering Inferno, which is like basically a metaphor for how society was coming apart. We build this huge tower, and there's this scene in this movie where this guy is calling up to these people who are up in this restaurant up at the top, and he's like, hey, I really think we need to evacuate everybody. And the guy on the phones at the restaurant is like, well, is it really that serious? I really don't see the rush. And right, like this is an example. This was like representative, indicative of what was going on in the 70s. Is it really that big of a deal? Yes. America is on fire right now, and our leaders don't seem to give a damn, right? That man up at the top, that's basically our leadership. Everybody else is like, why are you not paying attention to this? The building is on fire, and yet you're just standing around, right? And so, but there's other ones. The China Syndrome, that's about a nuclear meltdown. Airport 77, right? All of these issues, all of these are really good. But then also during the 70s, take a look at some of the dramas. And some of the ones that I'm thinking of are going to be, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Dog Day Afternoon, All the President's Men. These are movies like, or Taxi Driver. That's a great one. Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro in it. Like, definitely take a look at this film here. This is probably one of the best examples that maybe many of us could relate to today. So you have this individual, um, it's a film by Martin Scorsese, and it's set in New York City in the 70s. And this individual, Robert De Niro, and you could see this movie, he's a veteran, a Marine coming out of Vietnam, right? I think his name is Travis Bickle. Yes, there it is, Travis Bickle, right? He works nights as a taxi driver. Okay. But what we see in this film is that he's in the most populous city, one of the most populous cities in the world, and he's completely isolated from everybody, right? He can't build a connection with anybody. And so this was something that was really indicative of how people felt in the 70s, right? I don't feel a connection. I feel distant. I no longer feel like I'm a part of this group, right? These are the types of films that really give us a sense of what was going on in the 1970s. But Taxi Driver is something that we can relate to today. We have the ability to feel, be connected with anybody in the world at any time through these devices. And yet, we see higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, higher rates of identity crises, right? All of these issues that are happening, this is very much paralleling what was going on in the 70s, right? Disillusionment. We have the abilities to be connected, and yet we feel more disconnected. We feel more estranged. We feel more manipulated, right? We feel that we're being controlled by technology, very similar to what was going on in the 70s. Technology used to seem like, oh, this is a good thing. It can make things better, more convenient. I can reach out to anybody I want. And yet I don't pick up the damn phone, right? I don't reach out to those people. And so what I want you to think about with American disillusionment is really to think about how exactly and why exactly that happened during the 70s. We see it as a consequence of the economy. We see it as a consequence of leadership. We see it as a consequence of our culture, right? The shift that's going on. America was going through some turmoil and nobody really could understand it. Think about where we are right now. Very similar place. Same thing. We are going through a period of disillusionment. People just can't seem to understand what's going on. Like if trying to understand like how is it that people are still okay with supporting a president who's brought gas prices to $5? The inflation hasn't gone down. Jobs aren't being created. People can't afford houses. We have more abilities to stay connected, and yet I feel more distant. The disillusionment is that parallel. Okay. So if you have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to reach out. Please text me. Okay. That's probably the best way, or just send me an email, through the nmazer 1223, because that's the better way to reach me. Okay. Love to hear from you guys.